The sun's rays barely pierced through the thick veil of clouds, painting the streets of Dakota Creek in a soft, golden light. The silence, typical for this tiny town in South Dakota, was only broken by the occasional birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Early in the morning, Gerald Haywood sat on the porch of an old house. His eyes, once filled with a lively spark, now seemed tired and somewhat detached. Alzheimer's disease was slowly but surely erasing the details of his past, leaving only fragments of memories. Next to him, an old wooden rocking chair creaked, which had been Gerald's faithful companion during long hours of solitude. It was here that he usually sat, looking at the quiet street, waiting for the past to return with the next gust of wind. But this morning his gaze stopped on something unexpected. At the gate, as if carved from sunlight, stood a German shepherd with smooth, amber fur and an alert gaze. The dog sat motionless, waiting for an invitation. Its eyes, so intelligent and perceptive, met Gerald's, and for a moment, the man felt a strange, inexplicable warmth. This was not just an animal wandering in search of food or shelter. There was something more in this dog, something indescribable. "Well, hello there, buddy," Gerald said, his voice sounding hoarse but gentle. The man carefully leaned on his cane and stood up, approaching the gate. He looked around, as if hoping to see someone looking for the dog, but the road was empty. Meanwhile, the shepherd did not move. It watched Gerald's every move, but showed neither fear nor aggression. At that moment, Gerald felt as if he had experienced something similar in another life, which he could now only guess about. In the house, at the kitchen table, Seth Haywood, his son, was distracted from work, hearing the faint creaking sound of the porch. He looked out the window and frowned. Seeing his father standing at the gate next to an unfamiliar dog, Seth quickly stood up and headed for the door. "Dad, what are you doing?" His voice was stern, but there was a note of concern in it. "There's a dog, Seth," Gerald replied, not taking his eyes off the shepherd. His hand was already reaching for the latch on the gate. "Look at him. He's special." Seth approached closer, giving the dog a scrutinizing look. Ridger, as they would later name him, did not move from his spot, but his eyes held confidence. It was as if a silent promise. "I am not here by chance." "You don't know where he's from, Dad." Seth cautiously placed his hand on his father's shoulder. "He might belong to someone." "Or to no one," Gerald quietly objected. Their argument was brief. Gerald insisted that they should let him in, at least for one night. Ridger, accepting this decision, calmly stepped forward, and Gerald patted his head. At that moment, the man felt something that had long since ceased to exist, a quiet joy and an inexpressible sense that life might not be so empty after all. Meanwhile, beyond the gates of the small town, the night grew, bringing with it trials that neither Gerald nor Seth could yet suspect. The first days with Ridger passed surprisingly calmly. The German shepherd, as if understanding that he had found himself in a new home, behaved restrainedly. He did not bark without reason, did not spoil the furniture, and rarely left Gerald's side. It was clear that his presence filled the house with a special potential that had been lacking here for a long time. Seth watched this sudden change with a dose of skepticism. He was sure that the dog's appearance would add to his already busy daily routine. However, instead, he began to notice unusual things that puzzled him. Gerald, who until recently spent most of his time in his rocking chair, began to go outside more often. He walked slowly but confidently with his cane in the backyard, and Ridger was always by his side, like a shadow ready to support him at any moment. "Dad, you hardly ever stay home now," Seth remarked one evening, setting the table. "Why stay home if there's a reason to go out?" Gerald replied with a smile that hadn't brightened his face in a long time. "Ridger is a good reason." Seth just huffed, but something inside him stirred. These walks not only enlivened his father, but also gave him, Seth, some free time. He could focus on work without worrying that Gerald would get lost in his thoughts again or forget to turn off the stove. One evening, Seth, tired after a long day at work, decided to go out to the backyard. The sky was painted with the bright colors of sunset, and the wind rustled in the treetops. Ridger and Gerald sat side by side, engrossed in something that resembled a conversation. "Are you talking to him?" Seth asked with a note of surprise, sitting down next to them. "Of course," Gerald replied, glancing at the dog. "He listens. Sometimes that's more important than talking." Seth couldn't help but smile. Gerald seemed to have found in Ridger what he had long been missing, a companion and a confidant. The next day, during another walk, Gerald, leaning on his cane, stopped by the blooming bushes in the far corner of the yard. Ridger, as always, stood beside him. Gerald ran his hand over the smooth fur and suddenly said, "This bush reminds me of your mother's garden. She always loved yellow flowers." Ridger slightly tilted his head, listening intently. A fleeting sadness crossed Gerald's face but quickly disappeared, giving way to a quiet smile. Seth watched this scene from the kitchen window. Something in his father's behavior seemed strange to him, but at the same time encouraging. Gerald looked better than he had in the past few months. "How do you do it, buddy?" Seth muttered, addressing Ridger as if the dog could hear him. Later in the evening, Seth noticed a long scar on Ridger's hind leg. It was an old wound, healed but leaving a large trace. "Dad, did you see this?" he asked, directing his gaze to the dog's leg. Gerald shook his head. "No, but it doesn't matter. We all bear our scars, Seth. What matters is what we do afterward." Seth was at a loss for words, but his thoughts often returned to Ridger. Who was he? Where did he come from? And why did it seem like he was here for a reason? There were no answers to these questions yet, but one thing Seth knew for sure. With Ridger's appearance, their home began to come alive, and with it his father. Night fell on Dakota Creek with its usual silence, occasionally broken by the rustling of the wind and the distant hooting of an owl. The Haywood house was enveloped in semi-darkness. A strange light shone from the table lamp in the living room, where Gerald peacefully slept in his chair. His old blanket was carefully draped over his shoulders, and next to him, curled up, lay Ridger. The dog was on guard, his ears periodically twitching, catching the sounds of the night. Seth, sitting in front of his laptop screen in the kitchen, took one last look at the laptop, closed the lid, and stretched. Fatigue reminded him of itself, but he still felt a certain anxiety that he could not explain. Making sure the doors were locked, he went to the bedroom, casting a final glance at Ridger. "You'll keep an eye on him, right?" he muttered. Ridger raised his head and gave a short wag of his tail, understanding what was required of him. The peace of the night was disrupted by an unexpected sound. At first, it was a faint rustle at the back door, then a dull thud, as if someone was trying to break something. Ridger instantly tensed, his body stiffened, and his ears stood up. A deep growl escaped from his chest, low, dangerous, like a warning. Gerald, hearing this sound, woke up. His eyes wandered around the room until they stopped at the door. "What's that, buddy?" he asked, but his voice trembled. Ridger did not take his eyes off the source of the noise. He rose to his feet and moved towards the door, his steps quiet and measured. At that moment, Gerald realized that something was wrong. In the kitchen, Seth was startled by the crash. The sound was sharp, as if someone was trying to break the window. He jumped out of bed and grabbed the nearest baseball bat. "Damn it," he muttered, heading towards the living room. He found his father standing in the chair, tightly gripping his cane. Ridger stood in front of him, shielding him with his massive figure. The dog continued to growl, looking towards the kitchen. "Dad, stay here," Seth said sternly, walking around them and heading towards the sound. But he didn't get far. There was a crash, the glass on the back door shattered, and a man in dark clothes burst into the house. In his hands was a crowbar, which he held like a weapon. Ridger lunged forward without hesitation. His growling turned into loud, threatening barking. The man hesitated, but then raised the crowbar, ready to defend himself. However, Ridger was faster. He jumped, knocking the intruder to the ground with his powerful paws. The crowbar fell to the floor with a thud, and the shepherd's teeth clamped down on the intruder's sleeve. "Damn! Get this dog off me!" the man screamed, trying to break free. Seth rushed over, raising the bat, but Ridger had already handled it himself. A young man, who had stayed outside, saw that their plan had failed and rushed to the car. In a panic, he shouted, "We're leaving. Hurry up!" Ridger released the captured man only when he, staggering, made his way through the broken window. The shepherd watched their retreating shadows, not taking his eyes off them as they disappeared into the darkness. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The officers listened attentively to Seth's story, examined the crime scene, and praised Ridger for his actions. "You understand that you are not just a dog, but a real protector?" one of the policemen said. Seth looked at Ridger, who sat next to Gerald, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Yes, I understand that," he replied with an unusual warmth for him. When everything calmed down and the police left, Seth sat next to his father. Gerald, petting Ridger, said, "This guy saves us. Did you see that, Seth?" He knew what to do. Seth watched the dog, still wondering. Who was Ridger before he appeared in their lives? And what brought him here, to this house, at the very moment when they needed him so much? The next morning, the Haywoods woke up in a strange mix of gratitude and bewilderment. The light barely pierced through the thick clouds, leaving the rooms bathed in a soft half-light. In the kitchen, Seth carefully poured himself a cup of coffee, occasionally glancing at Ridger, who lay peacefully at Gerald's feet. The dog was calm, but his ears occasionally twitched, as if he were still on guard. "He's not just a dog, Seth," Gerald said, breaking the silence. I don't know. He's something more." Seth's mind still flashed with scenes from the previous night. How Ridger lunged at the intruder, how his anger turned into a protective shield for their home. During the day, after calling the police, Seth decided to post on social media. He took a photo of Ridger. The dog sat on the porch, his amber eyes looking straight into the camera. Under the photo, Seth wrote, "This is Ridger. He saved my father and me from robbers last night. We don't know where he came from, but now he is part of our family. If anyone knows anything about his past, please write to us." The post quickly gained popularity. People left comments, admiring the dog's bravery and expressing support. Many shared their own stories about loyal pets, some even calling Ridger a hero. However, one comment immediately caught Seth's eye. "This dog looks like my Rocky. He went missing during a storm several months ago. He should have a scar on his hind leg. Please message me if this is him." It was signed by a woman named Teresa. Seth looked at the phone screen for a long time, trying to comprehend what this might mean. He felt a growing respect. If Ridger was indeed her dog, what would they tell Gerald? "Dad," he began cautiously over dinner, "I got a message about Ridger." Gerald looked up, and Ridger, as if sensing that the conversation was about him, raised his head and looked at Seth. "A message?" Gerald asked. "Yes. A woman named Teresa says this dog might be hers. She lost him several months ago." Silence hung in the room. Gerald looked away. His face softened, but his voice remained firm. "No, Seth. That's not true. He's ours." Seth realized the conversation would not be easy. "Dad, if this is really her dog, we need to at least find out if it's true. And if it is?" Gerald's voice trembled. "Do you want him to leave? After all, what has he done?" Ridger got up and gently nudged Gerald's hand with his head, as if comforting him. "I don't know, Dad," Seth honestly replied. "But we need to figure this out." The next day, Teresa responded to Seth's message, suggesting a meeting in Dakota Creek. She described her dog's size, color, and most importantly, the scar on the hind leg just like Ridger's. When Seth told his father about this, Gerald was silent for a long time. Finally, he sighed and said, "Fine, let her come. But I'm telling you, Seth, he stays." Seth said nothing. He didn't know how Gerald would react if he had to part with Ridger. But inside him, too, grew the feeling that this dog had already become part of their family. The next morning, Teresa arrived in Dakota Creek. The woman looked excited but attentive. She approached the house and immediately focused on Ridger, sitting on the porch. "Rocky," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. Ridger looked at her intently, then stood up and slowly approached. "It's him," Teresa whispered, her voice trembling. "It's definitely him." Seth and Gerald watched this scene in silence. Ridger cautiously approached the woman, sniffed her outstretched hand, but then returned to Gerald. "See," Gerald said softly, petting the dog's head. "He chose us." Teresa lowered her hand, her eyes filling with tears. "He was always a protector," she said. "He protected my daughter, but it seems he's yours now." Her words hung in the air, leaving room for emotions that couldn't be expressed in words. The sky over Dakota Creek slowly filled with gray clouds, as if nature sensed the tension lingering in the Haywood house. Teresa sat on the old porch, her hands nervously playing with the edge of a light scarf, her eyes repeatedly returning to Ridger. The dog lay at Gerald's feet, his amber eyes attentively watching her every move. "I didn't expect to see him like this," Teresa finally said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "When he disappeared, I lost hope." Seth, standing by the front door, remained silent, giving his father and Teresa a chance to speak. He saw how Gerald slowly petted Ridger's head, as if convincing himself and the dog that everything would be okay. "It was a storm," Teresa continued. "We live outside the city. One night, and he was gone. I searched for him for weeks, posted flyers, called all the shelters in the area." "Maybe that's how it was meant to be," Gerald said quietly, not looking up. His words, spoken unexpectedly, made Teresa fall silent. "You don't understand," he said, slowly raising his gaze. "When he appeared here, I was nobody. I was losing myself, and my son saw it. And then he came." Gerald smiled slightly, and a flicker of clarity crossed his face. "Ridger reminded me that I can still be someone. He's not just a dog. He's the reason I get up in the morning." Teresa looked at the man, her eyes filling with tears. "I see that," she whispered. "But he was part of our family. My daughter, she missed him. Every night, she fell asleep hugging his old leash." Those words cut through the air like a knife. Gerald turned away, his hand momentarily freezing on Ridger's head. "Dad," Seth gently intervened, sitting down next to him. "We should think about this. Maybe it's the right thing to do." But Gerald shook his head, his voice firm. "I've already decided, Seth. He stays." Teresa, seeing the unyielding resolve of the old man, lowered her eyes. She remained silent, accepting a fact that her heart was not yet ready to embrace. "Rocky, or Ridger," she finally said, "was always a protector. Once he saved my daughter, and it seems he's saving you too." Her voice trembled, but she held back her tears. Rising from the porch, Teresa looked at Ridger. "If he made a choice, I have to respect it." Gerald looked up, not believing his ears. "You really," he began, but couldn't finish. Teresa smiled sadly, but sincerely. "Yes, it will be hard, but maybe he found his place." As she walked to her car, Ridger stood up, but didn't follow her. He watched her leave, not taking his eyes off her until she disappeared around the bend. Seth approached his father and sat down next to him. "You're amazing, Dad," he said softly. But Gerald shook his head. "It's not me, Seth. It's him. He chose us." Ridger came closer and gently nudged Gerald's hand with his head, as if comforting him. Gerald petted his fur, and for the first time in a long while, a smile of peace appeared on his face. "Home isn't a place," he said softly, looking into the dog's eyes. "It's a feeling, and he knows that." Seth, watching them, suddenly understood. This house had finally found not just stability, but something much greater. Hope. After Teresa's departure, the Haywood house returned to silence, but this silence was different. It no longer reminded them of emptiness or loss. It was filled with warmth and peace. Ridger, settled at Gerald's feet, radiated confidence, knowing he had made the right choice. Seth, watching his father and the dog, felt a strange mix of relief and gratitude. Teresa could have taken Ridger, and they would have had no argument, but she left him. Her decision, made with pain, brought new life to their home. Gerald began spending more time outside. Now his walks in the backyard were more confident. Each of his steps was accompanied by Ridger, an almost invisible support. Sometimes they would stop by the old lilac bushes that Gerald's wife had once planted, the man watching the dog, as if returning to those days when his world was filled with joy. "See these flowers, buddy," he would say, crouching by the bushes. She always said lilacs smell like spring, even when it's snowing. Ridger sat nearby, attentively listening as if he could understand every word. Seth couldn't help but notice the changes in his father. He heard soft laughter coming from the porch more often or saw Gerald taking up long-forgotten hobbies. One morning, entering the kitchen, he froze, seeing his father at the table with a sheet of paper in front of him. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked cautiously. "Writing," Gerald replied without even looking up. "Trying to write down what I remember." Seth came closer and saw that the page was neatly filled with short notes, fragments of memories. But together they formed a small part of the puzzle that Gerald was trying to piece together. "That's great, Dad," Seth said, feeling his throat tighten. "It's because of him," Gerald added, pointing to Ridger. "He helps me remember." That same day, Seth decided to build a small shelter for the whole family. They drove to the outskirts of Dakota Creek, where a forest trail familiar to Seth from childhood began. Gerald walked slowly along the path, leaning on his cane, while Ridger attentively stepped beside him, occasionally glancing at his master. "This place reminds me of our hikes," Gerald said softly, stopping by a large moss-covered rock. "We've been here?" Seth asked in surprise. "You were just a kid, but yes," Gerald replied with a smile. "Your mother loved this place." Seth, struck that his father remembered such details, felt something stir in his soul. "You remember that well, Dad," he said. "I try," Gerald replied, sitting down on the rock. "But you know, sometimes memories come back when you least expect them." Ridger settled nearby, his fur touching Gerald's legs, as if saying, "I'm here. I'm with you." When they returned home, Seth felt that these walks had become something more than just a way to spend time together. They were a way to bring back morning moments, to restore a connection that had seemed almost lost. That evening, sitting on the porch, Gerald looked at the sky, where the first stars were already piercing the twilight. "You know, Seth," he said, breaking the cozy silence. "We've been given a gift." "What do you mean?" "Time," Gerald replied, petting Ridger. "With this dog, we have a little more time to be a family." Seth didn't know what to say. He just sat down next to him, putting his arm around his father's shoulders. At that moment, it became clear to him. Ridger brought not just protection, but something much greater. He gave them a chance to live again. The autumn sun slowly rose over the horizon, painting the skies above Dakota Creek in soft, golden hues. The Haywood house came to life with the first rays of light. Ridger was already on his feet, his paws quietly creaking on the wooden floor as he followed Gerald, who, yawning, prepared his morning coffee. The kitchen filled with familiar coziness, where the aroma of coffee mingled with the muted sounds of an old radio. Seth emerged from his room, buttoning his shirt as he walked. He stopped, noticing how his father smiled at Ridger, offering him a piece of toast. "Dad, don't you think he spoils us more than we spoil him?" Seth chuckled, sitting down at the table. "Not at all," Gerald replied seriously. "This guy deserves everything he wants." Ridger, as if understanding that he was being talked about, turned around and licked Gerald before calmly lying down at his feet. After breakfast, Seth suggested a walk to the forest trails where they hadn't been for several weeks. Gerald, slightly surprised, immediately agreed, reminding his son to take the cane. "I think we could all use some fresh air," Seth said, pulling on his jacket. The journey was leisurely. Gerald walked confidently, leaning on his cane, while Ridger accompanied him with his usual attentiveness, not lagging behind. The leaves on the trees shimmered with bright colors, and a light breeze whispered its autumn melodies. At dawn, they stopped by large fields where an old oak tree stood tall. Gerald paused, looking at the tree. "We used to come here," he said, his voice soft but tinged with sadness. "She loved this place. We had a picnic here once." Seth remained silent, not knowing what to say. These words sounded so unexpected yet natural. His father seemed fully absorbed in the moment, and it filled Seth with quiet joy. "Dad, you remember these things?" he asked cautiously. Gerald looked at Seth, then at Ridger, who sat nearby, watching them intently. "Sometimes memories come back," he replied. "Not everything, of course, but some things remain, and it seems he helps me not to forget." Ridger wagged his tail, as if confirming Gerald's words. Upon returning home, Gerald looked tired but content. Seth, seeing his faint smile, felt that this was one of the changes he had been waiting for so long. "You're doing great, Dad," he said, helping Gerald get comfortable in his chair. "It's all thanks to him," Gerald replied, pointing to Ridger, who immediately laid down at his feet. "This guy gave me something I no longer expected." Seth sat down next to him and silently watched as his father stroked Ridger's head. The house was filled with a cozy silence, not of words, but of understanding. Late in the evening, when the sun had already hidden behind the hills, Seth and Gerald sat on the porch, enjoying the coolness. The sky above them sparkled with the first stars. Ridger lay at Gerald's feet, his amber eyes reflecting the moonlight. "You know, Seth," Gerald suddenly said, "I was afraid that you were here all this time out of pity." Seth frowned but remained silent, letting him continue. "But now I see that you stayed not because you had to, but because you wanted to," Gerald added. "That makes everything right." Seth looked at his father and smiled, feeling his throat tighten with emotion. "We're family, Dad," he replied softly. "And that's the most important thing." Ridger raised his head, approving the words. The night brought silence, but it was the kind of silence that warms. The Haywood house had finally found its harmony. On the porch, under the moonlight, a father, a son, and their loyal protector sat together, feeling that their bond was stronger than ever.